Welcome back to the History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. Now, this lecture is going to be a little different because, well, I didn't spend the, 8 or so hours in actually creating the PowerPoint. So, you're just going to be listening to me a whole lot. Forgive me for that, but it's just how it's going to work out for this one. I wanted to make sure that I actually spoke this instead of just, writing a lecture and having you read it, because this is dealing with the Exodus. And the Exodus is a pretty important topic, especially for the history of the ancient Near East. Specifically, in the punctular time events showing how the history of the ancient Near East compares to the biblical narrative concerning the Exodus. So, we will be talking about the date of the Exodus, whether late bronze / iron or middle bronze / late bronze, and then where I fall on this topic. And then we're going to talk about the Egyptian history and culture, basically just giving a rundown, a quick overview of the Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom before touching on those again, but relating them to the Exodus narrative. So, without further ado, hang on to your hats as we dive into the Exodus. One more thing. Not really sure how this is going to work out, since all of my notes are literally on one presenter note that I'm going to have to scroll through. So if I end up getting lost or something along those lines, just forgive me. All right. The story of the Exodus has been both a point of interest and contention within biblical scholarship for quite some time. Two main views about the Exodus have arisen. The Exodus was a real historical event, and the Exodus is simply myth. Unfortunately, very many modern biblical scholars simply don't believe that the Exodus was a historical event, instead placing the narrative into the classification of an origin myth for the people later known as the Israelites. Although this view is held by many a scholar, there are also very many who believe that the Exodus to be a truly historical event. Among those biblical scholars who believe in the historicity of the Exodus, two main camps have been set. Those who believe that the Exodus occurred under Pharaoh Ramses in the Late Bronze II or even the Iron I periods, citing the use of the name Ramses in the biblical text as evidence for the date, and those who hold to a late bronze, sometimes even middle bronze date, citing biblical chronology as a source for the timing. Now, dating of the Exodus. Now, scholars within this debate range between four positions. Those who believe that the Exodus occurred in the Late Bronze II or Iron I periods include both Ramses II or Ramses III, utilizing the name Ramses as evidence for these dates. And two other proposals are also given, one dating to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, dating to around 1550 BC, but revised to 1470 BC, and the traditional date of 1446 BC in Late Bronze 1B. Well, a rather minor view of the Exodus purported by Manfred Bytek places the event at around 1150 BC, noting excavation results from sites such as Lachish, Heshbon, and Gibeon, sites that show evidence of attack during the period that may have occurred at the hands of Joshua. For example, since Lachish shows evidence of Egyptian domination dating to Ramses IV, whose reign ended around 1154 BC, it's argued that the conquest under Joshua could not have occurred until after that period of Egyptian domination. Perhaps the best-known dates for the Exodus come from Hollywood fame, noted in the 1956 Cecil B. DeMille film titled The Ten Commandments, starring both Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. In the film, Moses stands before Ramses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, a concept that dates back to William F. Albright, who is often called the Dean of Biblical Archaeology, and continues through rather important conservative scholars such as James Hoffmeyer. Evidences for the date include archaeological corroboration, such as Egyptian records mentioning brick-making shortfalls dating to 1275 BC under Ramses II, and the lack of any reference to Israelites in Egypt, Egyptian records, before the Mereneptah Stela. Now, the latter evidence is also used by those who deny the existence of the Exodus altogether. And while this view is still widely held, many who previously held the view have now moved on to just dismissing the Exodus as myth. Two other views, placing the historical Exodus in Late Bronze I, are also maintained. The view that the Exodus occurred at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. I know that's going to sound a little confusing because I just said Late Bronze I, but hang in there with me. The view that the Exodus occurred at the end of the Middle Bronze Age has been promoted by John Bimson, J.J. Bimson. This view notes the lack of fortified cities in the Late Bronze Southern Levant, a believed contradiction to the biblical text that describes walled cities to be attacked by Joshua. The final view is the traditional view of dating the Exodus to 1446 BC, based on the internal biblical chronology established in 1 Kings 6, which promotes the event as occurring 480 years before the dedication of the temple, which is known externally as dating to 966 BC. This is further supported by Judges 11:26, where Jephthah notes that the Exodus occurred 300 years prior to him. Now, although detractors suggest a lack of archaeological evidences supporting the traditional date, Bryant Woods and others have advocated support for the date from both the southern Levant and from Egypt, including the destructions of Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor, where archaeological evidence... I kind of just got lost there what I was doing. There we go. Oh, yeah, I see now. Again, forgive me. Let me start over there. Bryant Woods and others have advocated support for the dates, for the traditional date from both the southern Levant and from Egypt, including the destructions of Jericho, Ai, sometimes pronounced Ai, and Hatzor, where Middle Bronze defenses had been reused in the Late Bronze Age, and from the Nile Delta, where an 18th dynasty palace is found in the region of Pi-Ramses, dating to the traditional date of Moses, and where a mid-19th century Asiatic settlement is found, dating to the traditional time of Jacob. Okay, although each of the above-mentioned theories have their strengths and weaknesses, for some, the weaknesses are simply too strong to ignore. The dates... dating the Exodus to around 1150 BC is problematic since the Mereneptah Stela dates to 1220 BC. A stela inscribed under the orders of Pharaoh Mereneptah, mentioning a people group in the southern Levant called Israel. Well, you can't have Israel in the southern Levant before they've left Egypt. Now, of note, the view that the Exodus occurred in 1267 BC, while relying upon the biblical usage of the name Ramses and some archaeological evidences from the southern Levant, appears to dismiss the internal biblical chronology and attempts to squeeze the oppression and population growth of the Israelites into a 3-year period. So that doesn't really work. As with the other views, biblical historicity of the Middle Bronze view is assumed, but the biblical chronology is again ignored. Now, this is slightly corrected when Bimson revised his chronology by extending the Middle Bronze Age up to 1430 BC, and then the Exodus to 1470 BC. But the extending of the Middle Bronze Age necessarily contracts the Late Bronze Age, and obviously that does some problems with the archaeology of the Late Bronze Age. You can't squeeze it all down there together because it doesn't accommodate all of the archaeological data from Late Bronze 1. Thus, the traditional view of the Exodus, which is 1446 BC, is still the strongest date both biblically and archaeologically. Now, this is supported, though debated, by evidences at Jericho and in the Nile Delta. Okay, now jumping into the next section here of Egyptian history and culture, placing the Exodus at the traditional date of 1446 BC, much of Egyptian history falls into step with the biblical text, extending from Joseph in the Middle Kingdom to the Exodus in the New Kingdom. Now, understanding the historical background of the biblical text helps to better understand that biblical text. So during the Middle Kingdom, the site of Rawati in the Nile Delta, whose name translates as the door of the two roads, appears to have acted just as such, existing as an estate that stood between Egypt and the Levant. The complete name of the settlement is translated as the Royal Settlement of Amenemhat I, Justified of Rawati, a planned settlement with royal favor. During the Middle Kingdom, this royal settlement seems to have been the home to a high Asiatic functionary in the service of the King of Egypt. Living quarters outside the royal estate consisted of sand brick huts that may have been in the beginning stages of royal development, and the estate itself appears to have followed the four-room house plan native to the southern Levant. Additionally, a tomb for an Asiatic dignitary has been discovered, and I talked about that in the last lecture. Now, by the Second Intermediate Period, the site of Rawati became known as Avaris. From this site, that continued to grow in the declining 13th dynasty, Asiatics gained power and ruled over much of Lower Egypt as the 14th dynasty. In the early years, ruling primarily over fellow Levantines in the region, including those living in settlements granted by the late 12th dynasty kings. By around 1640 BC, another Asiatic group was able to gain control over Avaris, initiating the 15th or Hyksos dynasty, controlling Lower Egypt and even, for some time, Upper Egypt. These Asiatic rulers, ruling from the harbor town of Avaris, were well connected to outside entities such as those at Cyprus, Palestine, and even Crete. And under the Hyksos, Avaris was developed into a historically large and very important site. Building projects at Avaris include temples to the storm god and his consorts, but also palaces, both types of which contain similar architecture to buildings in northern Syria and Mesopotamia. Of note, palaces F and G were built parallel to each other, separated by a massive lake, Palace G likely being the residence of the Hyksos pharaoh. Well, the Middle Kingdom site of Rawati, which was known later as Avaris, became known as Peru-Nefer in the early New Kingdom, only later to be rebuilt as Ramses. Of note, the large basin south of the Hyksos Palace F appears to have remained active in the New Kingdom, as evidence from a New Kingdom fortification wall running parallel to the straight edge of the rectangular lake. Interestingly, Amenhotep II appears to be the pharaoh mainly associated with Peru-Nefer, and he even fostered several Canaanite cults, including both Baal and Astarte. Unfortunately, Egyptian texts fail to mention Peru-Nefer after the reign of Amenhotep II, until the later Amarna age, likely signaling an abandonment of the site. Now, here's where the fun begins. Much of the information that I just gave you directly correlates to the biblical text. Now, this is particularly so when the date of 1446 BC is understood to be the date of the Exodus. As such, the Middle Kingdom conforms to the time of Joseph. The second intermediate period, also known as the Hyksos period, correlates with the initial enslavement of the Israelites, and the New Kingdom corresponds to the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt. Now, as noted in our last lecture, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt marks the initial period whereby a slave could rise to ranks of power, and this sometimes included outsiders, such as Asiatics. The existence of such an Asiatic functionary is seen at the royal settlement of Rawati, where the tomb of that Asiatic has been discovered. Now, although the tomb had been robbed out long ago, including the rather atypical removal of the body, the remains of a 2-meter-tall statue of a seated Asiatic was found purposefully smashed in a robber's pit dug into the tomb. The correlation of the biblical text comes in the fact that the biblical Joseph was said to have risen to the rank of vizier, ruler of all of Egypt. Although Asiatics are known to have come to positions of power, there was also a fear of outsiders at this time, even to the point of building a fortress to repel any large-scale movements of Asiatics to Egypt. Now, Genesis 42:9 mirrors this distrust when this Egyptianized Joseph replies to his brothers that they are spies coming to search for Egyptian weaknesses. Of course, in the end, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and the Pharaoh settles them in Ramses, then known as Rawati. The Asiatic functionary found in Tomb 1 of Rawati may very well be the biblical Joseph, whose body and grave goods were taken much later in history, as noted in Exodus 13:9-22. Other correlations can be seen in the previous lecture. Now, with the destabilization of the 13th dynasty, as Asiatic groups grew in the Delta and Egyptian pharaohs retreated southward, there came a ruler who knew not Joseph, as noted in Exodus 1:8. Although uncertain, this may be the beginning of Egyptian dominance over the Israelites, particularly as the 14th dynasty ruled over Asiatic groups in the Delta, including those living in settlements granted by the previous Egyptian kings. Well, if not the 14th dynasty, then certainly it was the 15th or Hyksos dynasty who enslaved them. The site of Rawati, most likely the residence of Joseph and the surrounding huts of his brother, would be changed under the 15th dynasty into the site of Avaris, including the building of Canaanite temples and palaces. In later years, the site would come to be known as Ramses, as noted in Exodus 1:11, where the Israelites were enslaved and forced to build the store cities of Pithom, which we're not sure where it is, and Ramses, the time of the Israelite slaves, known as Avaris. Now, although the Hyksos were eventually expelled from Egypt and followed into the southern Levant, the Israelite slaves apparently remained under the overlordship of the native Egyptian pharaohs, who continued the mistreatment. Now, it was under the New Kingdom pharaohs that Moses comes into the story. Of interest, palaces F and G, originally constructed under the Hyksos, continued in use during the New Kingdom, and the location and description of Palace F appears to match the description of Pharaoh's daughter going down to the Nile River to bathe in Exodus 2:5, and of Pharaoh himself going out to the river in the morning in Exodus 7:15. Notably, the Amenhotep II, who's described as he who dwells in Peru-Nefer, and who fostered Canaanite cults at the sites, including both Baal and Astarte, may be the pharaoh of the Exodus, though this is still highly debated. As noted before, after the reign of Amenhotep II, the site of Peru-Nefer is not mentioned again until the Amarna Age, possibly signifying the end of royal usage, a concept that fits well the biblical narrative, as, according to biblical text, large amounts of slave labor connected to the site were no longer available. Now, direct evidence of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt continues to elude archaeologists, but large numbers of slaves in Egypt during the New Kingdom are known. Now, that said, after such a loss of slaves, as described in the Exodus narrative, the campaigns of Amenhotep II after the date of the Exodus appear to have been an attempt to resupply the slave labor, including the capturing of more than 100,000 people and over 1,000 chariots. Now, in the end, we can't be dogmatic about who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, but the evidence appears to fit the biblical narrative supporting the existence of an Exodus. Again, I apologize that this didn't have all of the pretty pictures that I usually put in stuff, but hopefully you get the information that I was attempting to put across. Well, as always, if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.